The child stood at the edge of the marble floor, her sneakers damp from the rain outside, a faded denim backpack clutched to her chest like armor. No one had asked her name, no one had looked her in the eye. But the room had shifted the moment she walked in, as if it sensed something it could not explain. The penthouse apartment of Victor Harrow was not a home. It was an announcement. Walls of glass gave the illusion of command over the Atlanta skyline, but the air inside was thin and cold, as if even the oxygen had been curated. Sculptures no one ever touched stood like frozen sentinels along the walls. The furniture gleamed, arranged not for comfort but for performance. Rain streaked the windows. A thunderhead curled in the distance, low and dark, as though nature had conspired to match the tension in the room. Ruby didn't belong here. She knew that. Her jeans were too loose at the waist and stained at the knee. Her t-shirt bore a cartoon fox whose colors had long faded in the wash. But her mother needed the money. So Ruby had followed her through the revolving glass doors and into a world that was polished, precise, and utterly indifferent. Her mother, Rosa, didn't speak as they rode the elevator up. Her face was already fixed in that careful, unbreakable quiet that she wore to work like a second skin. Rosa was not allowed to bring her daughter, not technically, but Victor Harrow had insisted on a last-minute dinner with Japanese investors, and the agency had called Rosa in desperation. There had been no one else. As the elevator opened, the scent of something floral and expensive curled through the air. A woman stood at the far end of the hallway, clipboard in hand, posture ramrod straight. This was Lillian Harrow, Victor's wife. "You're late," she said, without looking up. Rosa checked the time on her phone. They were 5 minutes early. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrow," Rosa murmured. Lillian's eyes flicked to Ruby. "And what is this?" "My daughter. She will stay out of the way." "She better," Lillian said. Her voice was soft, but left no room for misunderstanding. She turned on her heel and disappeared down the hallway without another word. Ruby followed her mother into the kitchen, where stainless steel countertops gleamed like scalpels and a glass bowl held precisely arranged lemons. Rosa picked up a tray of empty flutes. "Just be still," she whispered. "If you have to move, move like a shadow." Ruby nodded. Outside the kitchen, the Harrow's son, Julian, was sprawled across a white leather sofa, his fingers scrolling absently across his phone screen. He wore loafers without socks and a smugness that seemed built into his bone structure. As Ruby passed, his eyes slid to her backpack. "Cute," he said, not smiling. "What is that, vintage Goodwill?" Ruby didn't answer. The ache behind her ribs was familiar. Quiet humiliation. She didn't even flinch. Her mother moved through the room, passing drinks to guests who didn't acknowledge her presence. The room filled slowly. Suits, glossy shoes, laughter that never touched anyone's eyes. Victor entered last. He had the kind of presence that filled every inch of the space. Not with warmth, but with volume. His suit looked expensive enough to feed a family for a month. He kissed the air beside Lillian's cheek, then shook hands with the visiting delegation. The head of the delegation, Mr. Kenzo Ishikawa, bowed slightly and spoke in soft Japanese. Ruby understood the words, even if they weren't meant for her. She had learned to read and speak the language fluently, her grandfather's doing. She had spent entire summers with him in his small apartment filled with paper lanterns and old poetry books. He said language was the only way to really know someone. Victor's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Let's get to it, shall we? We have a lot of money to make." He gestured toward the coffee table, where a thick leather binder had been laid out with great ceremony. On one page, a dense English contract. On the opposite, the Japanese translation. Ruby hadn't meant to look. She was just collecting empty glasses like her mother told her. But her eyes fell on the page and froze. The kanji was clear. painfully clear. The clause, written only in the Japanese version, was not a mere oversight. It was a trap. A sudden pressure built in her chest. She stepped forward. "That's not what it says," she said. The room stopped breathing. Victor turned slowly. "What did you say?" Ruby's voice was quiet but steady. "That clause, the Japanese side. It says if certain market conditions are met, Mr. Ishikawa's assets can be seized." Kenzo Ishikawa turned his head. Victor's jaw tensed. "She's just a kid," he barked. "She doesn't know what she's reading." Kenzo spoke. Not to Victor, to Ruby, in Japanese. "Where did you learn our language?" Ruby bowed slightly. "My grandfather taught me. He served in Okinawa. He said it is the duty of the young to remember what the old survived." Victor's face drained of color. Lillian stood frozen. Julian sat up straighter. The smirk vanished from his lips. Mr. Ishikawa picked up the contract, scanned the page, then turned to his interpreter. A long, aching silence. The interpreter swallowed hard. "She is correct," he said. Ruby looked at her mother. Rosa's hand was trembling, though her face remained still. Victor moved toward the contract, as if he could still undo what had just happened. But he was too late. Kenzo Ishikawa closed the binder. He turned to Ruby and gave her the kind of bow reserved not for equals, but for someone who had just told the truth when it mattered most. The pen never touched the page. Mr. Ishikawa's fingers hovered over the contract, steady as stone. He did not blink. His eyes lingered on Ruby, then flicked briefly to Victor Harrow. He withdrew his hand without a word and closed the binder with deliberate finality. The subtle thunk echoed louder than any slam. Victor's voice cracked into the silence. "She's a maid's daughter," he snapped, his smile stretched thin like aging plastic. "A child with no credentials, no education." "She's fluent," Mr. Ishikawa interrupted. His voice was low, unshaken, and precise. The words fell like stones in a still lake. Behind him, his two aides exchanged a glance. The interpreter, a man named Collins with damp palms and a badly knotted tie, stepped back as if trying to disappear into the floor. Rosa moved forward, her hand catching Ruby's wrist. She squeezed, but gently now, not to silence, only to steady. "I apologize." "Sir," Rosa said, voice barely above a whisper. "She's just a child. She meant no disrespect." "I saw no disrespect," Ishikawa replied, still watching the girl. Julian Harrow broke the tension with a scoff. "This is absurd. She probably memorized some phrase from a manga." Collins flinched. Mr. Ishikawa didn't respond to Julian. He turned instead to the interpreter. "In Japanese," he said calmly, "translate every word of Clause 17. Collins's mouth worked, but no sound came. Mr. Ishikawa spoke again. "Or shall the child do it?" Victor's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "We are in the middle of closing one of the largest real estate partnerships in the state, and you're taking legal advice from a 12-year-old? "She's 12? Mr. Ishikawa asked. Ruby lifted her chin. "Almost 13. Victor laughed, but the sound was brittle. "It's a mistake. A typo. We'll fix it." "She did not say it was a typo," Ishikawa replied. "She said it was a trap." Collins wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his suit. "Sir, I was told the Japanese version would not be examined closely. I received an additional payment for condensing some legal phrasing." Victor spun. "You're paid to translate, not to interpret." "No, sir," Collins murmured. "You paid me to deceive." The room stilled. Lillian took a half-step back. Julian stared at the carpet. Rosa held Ruby close now, the way a tree might lean into a storm to protect the only thing that matters. "I trusted you," Victor hissed at Collins. You were vetted. By your office, Collins replied, straightening. But I will not carry this weight for you. Victor's voice cracked. Get out. All of you. The deal is off. It was never on, Mr. Ishikawa said. He stepped forward, away from the couch, toward Ruby. The girl stood motionless as he knelt slightly, not quite a bow, but a gesture rare enough to still the air. Your grandfather, he said, taught you well. Ruby nodded. He said your word matters more than your title. Mr. Ishikawa's face shifted, just for a moment. A flicker of memory, pain perhaps, or something older and quieter. He turned to Rosa. I hope you will forgive me, he said. For everything that was said to you tonight. Rosa's lips parted, but she said nothing. She had no script for this kind of apology. Julian rose from the couch, his voice bitter. So what? You're just going to walk away because a maid's kid had a Japanese bedtime story? Mr. Ishikawa turned. I will walk away because your family tried to take what was not theirs, and because the only honest voice in this room was the one no one invited. Victor was shaking now, his hands balled into fists. You'll regret this. I already regret stepping foot in your home, Ishikawa said softly. He signaled to his aides. They gathered their briefcases and coats without a word. As the elevator chimed, Ruby reached into her backpack and pulled something out. A slim, worn paperback, its corners curled, the spine nearly broken. She held it out to Mr. Ishikawa. This was his favorite, she said. He used to read it with me. He said it helped him understand. Mr. Ishikawa took the book with both hands. The gesture stunned the room into a different kind of silence. He opened the cover, saw the neat handwriting on the first page. To Ruby, may you always remember the stories behind the stories. Love, Grandpa. His fingers trembled slightly as he closed it. I will return this, he said. I know, Ruby replied. As the elevator doors slid shut behind them, Victor stood alone in the middle of the room, surrounded by empty glasses and people who no longer looked at him. Lillian walked to the sideboard and poured herself a drink. She didn't offer him one. Julian opened his mouth, then thought better of it. Ruby turned to her mother. Are we in trouble? She whispered. Rosa knelt, face pale, eyes soft. No, she said. We just told the truth. Outside, the city roared on. But in that penthouse, in that glass castle built on silence, something had broken open, and there was no putting it back. They rode the bus home in silence. The plastic seats were cracked, the overhead lights flickering in a steady rhythm that made Ruby's eyes ache. The city pressed in on both sides of the windows, endless neon and dark alleys, the sharp gleam of wet asphalt beneath the wheels. Rosa sat rigid beside her, shoulders still drawn tight like she expected someone to shout or accuse or grab her by the collar. But the voices stayed in the penthouse. Only the city whispered now. Ruby pressed her forehead to the cool glass and watched the streetlights blur past. Her backpack sat in her lap, the space where the book had been now oddly empty. She felt hollow and full at the same time, like something important had been torn loose, and something else, older and heavier, had moved into its place. Rosa broke the silence first. What you did, she said, her voice barely audible above the hum of the wheels. That was dangerous. Ruby nodded. You could have cost us everything. Another nod. She waited for the rest. The anger, the scolding. But Rosa only stared ahead. After a long moment, she said, I'm proud of you. It did not sound like a celebration. It sounded like a confession. When they stepped off the bus, the air was thicker, August heat that stuck to the back of your throat. Their apartment building was still 2 blocks away, nestled behind a convenience store and a row of boarded-up homes with broken windows like hollow eyes. Rosa carried her purse tucked tight under her arm, the way she did when walking through certain parts of the city at night. Ruby didn't speak again, not even when they passed the bakery with its metal gate pulled halfway down, not even when the police cruiser rolled by without slowing. Their apartment smelled like boiled rice and dust. A window unit rattled weakly in the corner, struggling against the humid air. Ruby sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers still curled from the ride. Rosa moved through the kitchen in silence, opening and closing cupboards, pouring water into a chipped glass, rinsing it twice before setting it on the counter. All habits, all things to do while avoiding the question hanging in the room like smoke. When she finally turned to her daughter, her expression was unreadable. "What happens next?" Ruby blinked. "I don't know." "They'll fire me." "Yes. Maybe worse." Ruby looked down at the floor, the peeling linoleum, the cracked edge of the baseboard, the pale outline of where an old rug used to be. Her voice came low. "I'm sorry." Rosa crossed the room and sat beside her. She didn't speak. Instead, she reached over and gently pulled Ruby's backpack toward her. She opened it. The empty pocket where the book had been stared back. Rosa zipped it closed and set it on the floor. "I spent most of my life trying not to be seen," she said, "because being seen meant being judged, and judged meant punished." She placed a hand on Ruby's shoulder. "But you saw what others missed, and you didn't blink." Ruby didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. A knock came at the door. Both of them stiffened. It was past midnight. Rosa stood slowly. She moved to the door without making a sound, peering through the tiny peephole. She hesitated. Then she opened it. A woman stood on the other side, late 30s, dark suit, hair in a short braid that tucked beneath her collar. Her presence was calm, like still water. "I apologize for the hour," she said, "but Mr. Ishikawa asked me to come directly." Rosa's mouth parted. She did not speak. "My name is Hana Shimizu. I'm his personal liaison. May I come in?" Rosa stepped aside. Hana entered with quiet grace, a leather satchel hanging from one shoulder. She scanned the apartment once, then offered Ruby a soft smile. "You left your book," she said. She opened the satchel and removed the familiar paperback, worn and loved, its spine even more fragile now than it had been that morning. Ruby took it with both hands, holding it as if it might dissolve. "Thank you." "He read it," Hana said. "Every page. Then he asked me to return it personally." Rosa stood to the side, watching with wary eyes. Hana turned to her. "He also asked me to deliver this." From the satchel, she pulled a plain white envelope. She handed it over without explanation. Rosa took it with trembling fingers. The weight inside was more than paper. "Mr. Ishikawa has no interest in vengeance," Hana said, "but he has a long memory, and your daughter has altered it." Rosa opened the envelope. Inside was a check. More than she'd ever seen on a single line of paper. Not a fortune, but enough. There was also a note, handwritten in crisp black ink. "Honor doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it comes in quiet shoes and frayed seams. Your daughter reminded me of that." Below the message was a second line. "A representative from our foundation will contact you within the week. We believe Ruby's education should not be limited by geography or finance." Rosa's hands shook. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You do not need to say anything," Hana replied. "Just know that the door she opened, we will not let it close behind her." She bowed slightly. Then she turned to Ruby once more. "He says the book was well chosen," she said, "and that you understood its meaning." Ruby nodded, her throat tight. Hana offered one final smile before stepping back into the night. When the door closed, the silence returned, But it was different now. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was the space after a storm, when the air smells like iron and wet stone, when things broken might still be repaired. Ruby sat on the floor with the book in her lap. Rosa sat beside her. They did not speak. They didn't need to. Ruby did not sleep that night. She lay on the pull-out mattress, the one that made her back ache by morning, listening to the hum of the street lamp outside their window. The paperback sat beside her pillow, its cover worn, the edges curled like leaves pressed between forgotten pages. She did not open it. She did not have to. The words lived in her now. The following morning, Rosa moved like a woman in someone else's skin. Her hands made coffee on autopilot. Her shoulders lifted and dropped in the rhythm of a woman expecting things to vanish. Like the envelope had been a dream. Like Hana Shimizu had never stepped through their doorway. But the envelope was still there, sealed again, lying atop the dusty fruit bowl. Rosa glanced at it every few minutes, as if it might sprout legs and walk away. Around 10, the phone rang. They both jumped. Rosa answered it in her usual way, polite, clipped, practiced. But within seconds, her face changed. She moved to the window as she listened, nodding slowly, her other hand pressed to her stomach as if steadying something inside her. When she hung up, she did not speak right away. "Who was it?" Ruby asked. Rosa stared at the phone. "The Tanaka Foundation," she said softly. "Mr. Ishikawa is a board member. They want to discuss long-term scholarship planning, a stipend for us, relocation, tutoring." Ruby sat still, not sure whether to breathe. Rosa blinked twice. "They want us to come in next week, meet their education director." Silence wrapped around the kitchen like a blanket held too tightly. Ruby whispered, "Is it real?" Rosa let out a slow breath. "I think it is." The next few days moved in strange, quiet waves. Rosa did not go back to work. No one from the agency called. No one from the Harrows either. It was as though that chapter had slammed shut so hard it vanished. But the absence was not relief. Not yet. It was too soon for that. On Thursday, Ruby walked to the library 2 blocks away. Her legs ached. The late summer heat stuck to her skin, thick as syrup. But the library was cool, and the old woman at the front desk smiled without asking any questions. She wandered the stacks for nearly an hour, running her fingers along the spines. When she found the foreign language section, she knelt beside a row of books with faded titles in kanji and hiragana. There was one she didn't recognize. Bound in soft red cloth, no dust jacket. She opened it. Inside were poems, short, brittle, razor-sharp. She read one, then another, then 3 more. Each one whispered something to her, something quiet and painful and strangely beautiful. She checked the book out and carried it home like a secret. That night she read one of the poems aloud at the kitchen table. Rosa listened as she dried dishes. When Ruby finished, Rosa said nothing for a long time. Then she set the dish towel down and said, "You sound like him." "Grandpa?" Rosa nodded. "He used to recite things like that. When I was young, before everything got harder." She sat down across from her daughter. "He always said books were doors, not escapes. Doors." Ruby touched the edge of the cloth cover. "Then, maybe this one's open." By Saturday, change arrived again. Not with fire or ceremony, but with a manila envelope slid under the door. Rosa found it early, just as the sun cut gold across the floor. She opened it without a word. Inside was a legal form, typed, clean, a contract termination, issued from the Harrow estate. The agency was closing Rosa's file, effective immediately, no severance, no recommendation. A single line in cold legal English. Employment concluded at the request of the client. No further communication advised. Rosa folded the letter, set it beside her coffee. She didn't swear. She didn't cry. She only said, "I expected worse." Ruby watched her. "You'll get something better." "Maybe," Rosa said. But she didn't sound convinced. Later that day, the phone rang again. This time, Rosa didn't answer on the first ring, or the second. When she finally picked it up, her voice had more steel than usual. Her expression shifted almost immediately. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course. We'll come." When she hung up, her voice dropped into something unreadable. "That was Mr. Ishikawa's assistant. He'll be back in town next week. He wants to meet us again. Just us." Ruby blinked. "Why?" Rosa shook her head. "He didn't say?" The meeting was scheduled for a modest office downtown, a building made of stone and red brick, tucked between a coffee shop and an elementary school. The kind of place no one noticed. The lobby smelled like pine cleaner and printer ink. A woman in a navy skirt suit greeted them, then led them through a long hallway into a quiet room with wide windows and 2 leather chairs. Mr. Ishikawa was already waiting. He stood as they entered. He wore no tie today, just a simple gray button-down shirt and dark slacks. No flourish, no boardroom performance, just a man. "Thank you for coming," he said. He gestured for them to sit. Ruby sat upright. Rosa sat cautiously, her hands folded in her lap. "I wanted to thank you both again," he said. Not formally, personally. Rosa offered a small nod. "You changed the trajectory of something very dangerous," he continued. "My team has spent the past week reviewing every document signed over the last 2 years. We found patterns." He let the word sit. "I intend to make those patterns public, quietly, legally. But your daughter, she was the first voice. That matters." Rosa's eyes darkened. "What will happen to them?" Mr. Ishikawa paused. "They will lose things they thought could not be taken." Ruby looked down at her hands. "I didn't mean to ruin them." He turned to her, his voice gentle. "You didn't ruin anything. You revealed something. That's different." Then quietly, "Would your grandfather have wanted you to stay quiet?" Ruby shook her head. Mr. Ishikawa leaned back. "Then you did the right thing." The sun spilled into the room through the windows. The city moved on, just outside. Cars, conversations, birds on wires. But inside that room, something had settled. A truth had landed and been accepted, not as a weapon, not as revenge, as recognition. The name Harrow no longer carried weight. It carried whispers. 2 days after the meeting at the foundation, the first story broke. Not on television, not in bold print. Just a small column on the 5th page of the local business journal. International firm withdraws from landmark Atlanta development. No names, no finger-pointing. But behind closed doors, the message spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, investors started pulling out. Then came the inquiries, the audit notices, the polite refusals to return phone calls, the locked doors where once there had been red carpets. Victor Harrow sat alone in his study, the skyline behind him smudged by rain. A glass of untouched scotch sat on the table. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. No one worth answering was calling anymore. Across from him, Lillian flipped through a magazine she was not reading. Her legs were crossed, her heel tapping the floor in slow, sharp beats. "You should have buried the contract," she said, eyes still on the page. Victor didn't reply. "You were greedy," she added, "and careless." Still, he said nothing. She set the magazine down and stared at him. "Do you know what we've lost?" His eyes met hers, finally. Not yet. A silence passed between them, long and bitter. She stood. I'm not going down with you. Victor didn't stop her as she walked out of the room. Back in their apartment, Ruby watched her mother move through the kitchen with new rhythm. Rosa still woke early, still made the same coffee, still folded the towels the exact same way. But her movements had changed. Her posture held something new. Not pride exactly, not relief, readiness. She no longer flinched at the phone. That morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, stamped with a discreet international seal. Ruby opened it on the kitchen table. Inside, the official scholarship confirmation from the Tanaka Foundation. Full tuition, private education, transportation, supplies, summer programs. A sealed folder for Rosa, outlining the living stipend. A second envelope addressed directly to Ruby. She opened it slowly. Inside, a handwritten letter from Mr. Ishikawa. Dear Ruby, I once believed silence was the cost of survival, that it was safer to watch than to speak. You reminded me that silence can also be a form of surrender, and that truth, when spoken at the right moment, is louder than power. This scholarship is not a gift. It is a path you earned. Walk it with purpose. K. Ishikawa. Ruby folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her book of poems. Later that afternoon, Rosa took Ruby to a new school across the city. It was nothing like the one she'd attended before. Tall brick buildings stood behind a wrought iron gate. There were gardens, actual gardens, where students read beneath trees. The security guard smiled and greeted them by name. Inside, polished floors shined beneath quiet hallways. The administrator, a tall woman with braids pulled back into a low knot, greeted them warmly. Her voice was low, confident, and kind. She had already reviewed Ruby's paperwork. She's ahead, she said to Rosa, particularly in language and writing. Her file included a writing sample in both English and Japanese. Who taught her? My father, Rosa said. He was thorough. The administrator smiled. He was effective. Ruby looked around the office, at the books on the shelf, the awards, the photographs of former students. She didn't say anything. When they left, Rosa glanced down at her. You like it? Ruby nodded. It feels real. That night, Rosa stood in the doorway to Ruby's room. It was not much. Just a mattress, a lamp, and a small desk they had bought from a neighbor. But it was hers. Her window overlooked a rusted fire escape and a dying tree, but the moonlight reached the wall and made it glow soft and silver. Rosa watched her daughter read for a while before speaking. You're going to do things I never dreamed of, she said. Ruby didn't look up from the page. Only because you carried me this far. Rosa's throat tightened. She crossed the room and sat at the edge of the bed. Your grandfather would have been proud, she said. Ruby closed the book and leaned her head against her mother's arm. I think he already knows. Somewhere across the city, Julian Harrow scrolled through comment sections that read like eulogies. Stock collapses. Quiet lawsuits. Photos of his father looking pale and stunned in an unguarded moment. No one reached out anymore. He tossed the phone onto his bed and stared at the ceiling. The apartment was still pristine, still full of expensive art and rare wine, but it felt like a gallery after hours, hollow, cold, meaningless. He'd heard whispers at school. Someone said a maid's daughter had blown up the deal. Others said it was a translator, or a mole, or a setup. Julian knew the truth, and it haunted him. He remembered the girl standing in their living room, her shoulders square, her voice even. He remembered the look in her eyes when she spoke, like she knew something no one else did, something unshakable. He'd laughed at her. Now she had rewired the city beneath him. He turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the silence his family had earned. At the Tanaka Foundation's Atlanta office, A meeting convened quietly. Mr. Ishikawa sat at the head of a modest table with two of his aides and a representative from the National Education Council. "We'll monitor the family's situation," one aide said. "Ensure they remain protected." The education director leaned forward. "She's gifted, but not just intellectually. She has presence. Most children her age avoid conflict. She walked into it." Mr. Ishikawa nodded. "Because she had nothing to lose." "And now?" He considered that. "Now she has everything to carry," he said. "We must make sure she's not alone." Outside, the sky had darkened. The city glowed quietly beneath it. Mr. Ishikawa stood and walked to the window. He looked down at the world of blinking lights and moving shadows. Somewhere out there, a girl in worn sneakers had changed the course of a very old game, and none of the players had seen her coming. The photograph arrived by courier. It came in a simple envelope, no return address, no note. Rosa found it resting on the doormat when she returned from the corner store. She stood there for a moment, the paper light in her hand, as if the weight of it had not yet caught up. Ruby was in the living room, curled on the couch beneath the old quilt, the paperback of poems open on her lap. She looked up when her mother entered. Rosa handed her the envelope. Ruby opened it slowly. Inside was a black and white photograph, old and gently faded. Two young men sat shoulder to shoulder on a crumbling wall. One wore a Japanese uniform, the other an American one. They were covered in dust, both smiling faintly, their expressions tired but intact. The American soldier had eyes just like Ruby's. She stared at the image, her thumb brushing over the name scrawled faintly on the back in pencil, Walter. She didn't say anything at first. She just held the picture to her chest. "Where did this come from?" Rosa asked. Ruby looked up. "Mr. Ishikawa said his grandfather carried a photo of Grandpa Walter. This must be it." Rosa sat beside her. "It's real, then?" Ruby nodded. "More real than anything." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, the quiet of the apartment settling like dust. Outside, children shouted in the distance. A dog barked. Somewhere, a siren wailed faintly and then faded. But inside, all was still. Later that week, Rosa received a second call from Hana Shimizu. This time, it wasn't about funding or paperwork. It was an invitation. "Mr. Ishikawa would like to meet again," Hana said. "Privately. Just you and Ruby, if you're willing." Rosa hesitated. "He already gave us more than we imagined." "Yes," Hana said, "but this isn't about what he gave. It's about what he remembers." They met at a Japanese tea house tucked between a dentist's office and an old bookstore. The building didn't look like much from the outside, but inside, it was warm and quiet, the scent of green tea and cedar welcoming them like old friends. Mr. Ishikawa rose when they entered. He wore no suit today, only a light jacket and pressed shirt. He bowed slightly to both of them. "Thank you for coming," he said. They sat in a corner booth where the noise of the world could not follow. Ruby glanced at the table. No documents, no ledgers, no forms. Just two porcelain cups and a clay teapot steaming gently. "Do you know why I asked you here?" Mr. Ishikawa said, pouring the tea with practiced grace. Rosa shook her head. Ruby watched, waiting. He set the teapot down. "My grandfather kept that photo with him until the day he died," he said. "He told me the story often, but it never felt quite real. I thought he had invented parts of it to cope with what happened in Okinawa." He paused. Then your daughter spoke. The steam from the tea curled between them. "That moment in your home, Ruby," he continued, "it brought something back I had not felt in a long time. Not anger, not victory, something deeper." Ruby whispered, "Honor?" He nodded. "Yes, that's the word." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a smaller envelope. Inside was a second letter. Not from him this time, but a copy of one written decades ago. "My grandfather tried to contact Walter after the war," he said. "He wrote to the U.S. Army, to veterans groups. No one answered. We now believe the letters never reached him." Ruby took the paper. The ink had faded, but the message was clear. A thank you. A memory. A wish that someday their paths would cross again. "My grandfather believed a debt had been left unpaid," Mr. Ishikawa said. "Now I believe that debt has passed to me." Rosa's voice was soft. "You owe us nothing." "I disagree," he said gently. "Because debts are not always financial. Sometimes they are about how we remember people, what we choose to carry forward." He looked at Ruby. "You've reminded me how dangerous it is to forget." A week later, Ruby began her new school. The first day was strange. Not because of the uniforms or the size of the building, but because for the first time in her life, no one looked at her like she didn't belong. She found herself sitting in a circle of students who talked about books, politics, and the kind of ideas her old classmates would have called weird. She didn't speak much. But when she did, people listened. One of her teachers, Ms. Carter, asked her to stay after class. "I read your application essay," the woman said, setting a folder on the desk. "You wrote about truth. You wrote like someone twice your age." Ruby shrugged. "I was just honest." Ms. Carter studied her for a moment. "Honesty is rare, so is courage." She tapped the folder. "I want you to consider entering the state writing competition next month. Top prize is a publishing mentorship. I think you'd do well." Ruby hesitated. "I've never won anything." Ms. Carter smiled. "Then it's about time." Back at home, Rosa stood in front of the mirror. She wore a navy blouse, new, and slacks she'd pressed herself. Her hair was pulled into a simple twist. On the table lay a business card from a nonprofit that partnered with immigrant women. The director had called earlier in the week. They were hiring coordinators, people with lived experience. Rosa reached for her purse and paused. The envelope from Victor Harrow's firm, the termination notice, still sat inside. She pulled it out, read the line again, then slowly, carefully, tore it in half, then into quarters. She dropped the pieces into the trash, picked up her keys, and left the apartment. She did not look back. That night, Ruby placed the photo of her grandfather and Mr. Ishikawa's grandfather beside her bed. She lit the small electric lantern he'd given her during the last meeting. It gave off a warm, amber glow. She thought of the generations behind her, the stories passed down, the ones buried, the ones almost forgotten. Then she opened her notebook and began to write. Not about power, not about the Harrows, but about legacy. About how sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that reshapes everything. The article began with a single sentence. Sometimes the smallest voice tells the loudest truth. It ran in the Sunday edition of the Atlanta Tribune. Not front page, not yet, but prominent enough to be seen. The byline belonged to a young reporter named Tess O'Connell, someone Ruby had never met, but who had spent the past 3 weeks unraveling the threads Mr. Ishikawa had carefully handed over. The headline did not name names, but the details left no doubt. A fraudulent contract, a forged clause, a high-stakes real estate deal dissolved just minutes before signing, a child interpreter, a quiet scandal rising from a glass tower in Midtown Atlanta. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By Tuesday, Victor Harrow's name was trending, not for his achievements, but for his downfall. Ruby read the article 3 times before school. She sat at the kitchen table in silence, the paper splayed open in front of her, the words printed in black that no one could take back. Rosa poured coffee in the background, but even her movements had slowed. She looked over Ruby's shoulder, her breath catching when she saw the quote from the anonymous source. The girl knew what the rest of us chose to ignore. She read what none of us bothered to translate. Rosa set the coffee pot down gently. "Are you sure you're ready for what comes next?" Ruby folded the paper closed. "I wasn't ready when it happened. I'm still here." At school, the shift was immediate. Teachers glanced at her a beat longer. Some students whispered her name in hallways, not unkindly, but with the kind of awe reserved for people who'd somehow stepped outside their expected place. During lunch, Ruby sat beneath the maple tree near the North Building. She had begun bringing her notebook out there every afternoon. It was the only place where her thoughts felt like they had room to breathe. That day, a girl named Marin approached and sat beside her. "I read the article," she said without preamble. Ruby didn't answer. "I think it's brave," Marin continued. "What you did. Most people pretend not to see things when money's involved." Ruby looked at her notebook. "I wasn't trying to be brave." "Most people aren't," Marin said. "But they still are." She offered a shy smile before walking away. Ruby stared after her for a long time. Across town, Julian Harrow sat in his father's study. The curtains were drawn, the room dark except for the blue glow of the TV. Victor was slumped in the leather armchair, tie loose, sleeves rolled. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. The news anchor's voice droned on. "Securities investigation underway. Multi-million-dollar breach of contract. Interpreter under scrutiny for falsification." Julian finally spoke. "Was any of it even legal?" Victor didn't look at him. Julian stood. "You knew, didn't you? You knew what that contract said." Victor's voice came hoarse. "I thought it would never be read." Julian stared at his father, a man he had once feared, admired, tried to become. He turned and walked out. And this time, Victor didn't stop him. The following day, Ruby was summoned to the principal's office. Not because she'd done anything wrong, quite the opposite. Ms. Hartley, the administrator who had first welcomed them, waited behind the desk with a man in a navy suit. His lapel bore a small silver pin in the shape of an open book. He introduced himself as Darren Pike, program director for the Georgia Scholars Initiative. "I've been reading your essays," he said. "Not just the ones in your file, the ones your teachers submitted. One in particular, the one about your grandfather, moved our entire review panel." Ruby blinked. "I didn't know they sent those." "They did," he said. "And we'd like to offer you a nomination. Full mentorship, statewide program. There's travel involved, writing workshops, guest lecturers. And if you advance, you'll be eligible for the National Young Authors Fellowship." Ruby's voice caught. "Why?" Mr. Pike smiled. "Because someone needs to write stories like yours." She didn't answer right away. Then she nodded. "I'll do it." That evening, Rosa stood in the hallway outside the kitchen, reading a text message from an unfamiliar number. It was from an attorney representing one of the Harrow firm's former board members, a man who had quietly resigned the week after the Tribune article hit print. The message was short. "They're preparing for litigation, but they know the battle is lost. Tell your daughter the truth cut deeper than they ever imagined." Rosa didn't reply. She simply set the phone down and walked into the kitchen, where Ruby was peeling carrots for dinner. "They're falling," she said quietly. Ruby didn't stop peeling. "I know." 2 days later, Rosa received a formal invitation in the mail. Cream-colored cardstock, gold trim. A city council event honoring local education partnerships. Attached to the invitation was a note, handwritten by Mr. Ishikawa. "Come as you are. You are exactly who they need to see." Rosa looked at her reflection that night for a long time. Then she borrowed a blouse from a neighbor and a skirt she hadn't worn in years. She and Ruby arrived at the event just before sunset. It was held on the rooftop of a mid-rise building downtown. Not a skyscraper, but tall enough for the city to stretch in every direction like a promise. The room quieted when they entered. Not out of shock, not out of judgment, out of recognition. Rosa walked beside her daughter, not behind her, not in her shadow, as equals, as women who had chosen to speak. Mr. Ishikawa met them at the entrance, bowed respectfully, and gestured toward the mayor's office representative. Introductions were made. Glasses were raised. A photographer asked for their names. And when Ruby looked out across the city skyline, she didn't see steel and concrete anymore. She saw stories. She saw voices waiting to be heard. And for the first time, she felt ready to help carry them forward. Spring arrived quietly that year, not with fanfare or sudden bloom, but in the subtle shift of light through the window, the faint scent of cut grass on the wind, the way mornings felt less heavy. Ruby noticed it as she walked to school. The sidewalks no longer puddled with gray, the trees outside her apartment just beginning to whisper green. Change, it turned out, did not come like thunder. It came like breath. She had stopped counting the days since everything changed. They no longer felt separate from the life she lived now, her new school, her new routine, the feeling of being seen. These had become normal. Not loud, not dramatic, just real. Her essay had made it through the first round of the statewide writing competition, then the second. Now she was one of 5 finalists. She hadn't told many people, not even her teachers, just her mother, and Mr. Ishikawa, who still called once a month. He always asked the same first question, "What are you reading?" And he always ended the same way, "What do you want to write next?" This morning, Ruby stood at the window brushing her teeth, staring at the building across the street. She watched an elderly man sweep the sidewalk in front of his store. A woman in scrubs locked her car and hurried into the corner pharmacy. The world kept moving. That mattered. Rosa entered the kitchen carrying a letter. No stamp, no postmark. Just her name handwritten across the front in unfamiliar ink. Ruby watched her mother open it carefully, her hands slow but steady. Inside was a short note. "Ms. Rosa Grayson, your application has been approved. We are pleased to offer you the position of Community Liaison Coordinator at Haven House, Atlanta. Your story, your voice, and your leadership are exactly what our women need. We hope you'll accept." Diane Carrington, Director. Rosa sat down at the table and stared at the paper. For a long time she said nothing. Then she folded the letter in half, ran her thumb over the crease, and whispered, "It's real." Ruby smiled. It always was. That weekend, Ruby and Rosa rode the train to the Veterans Memorial Cemetery outside the city. It was a place Rosa hadn't visited in nearly a year. Not since the gravestone had first been placed, not since Ruby's quiet defiance had brought the past roaring into the present. They brought 2 things, a photograph and a book of poetry. The gravestone was still clean, the letters sharp. Walter R. Grayson, beloved father, grandfather, soldier. Do right, even when no one's watching. Ruby knelt and placed the photo gently at the base of the stone. The 2 young men, her grandfather and Mr. Ishikawa's grandfather, side by side in uniforms from opposite sides of history, smiling in spite of it. She opened the poetry book and read aloud one of the verses. Her voice was clear, unshaken. To speak the truth is not to raise your voice, but to hold still, even when the world is loud around you. When she finished, she closed the book and let the silence settle. Rosa stepped forward and placed her hand on the stone. "Thank you," she whispered, "for teaching her what I couldn't say, for reminding me of who I used to be." They stood together for a long time before walking back toward the train. In Midtown, the Harrow name had all but vanished. The firm was dismantled piece by piece, most of it sold off. The rest collapsed under investigations and lawsuits. Victor Harrow withdrew from public life, his accounts frozen, his properties under review. Rumors swirled about offshore holdings, non-disclosure agreements, bribes, but no one had proof. What they had was silence. Lillian Harrow moved to New York. Julian disappeared from the press entirely. Occasionally, Ruby saw an old article resurface, but it never stayed long. The world had moved on. She had, too. The final round of the writing competition was held in a historic auditorium on the edge of the university district. The seats were packed with teachers, family members, and quiet strangers in blazers who took notes with serious faces. Each finalist read their piece aloud. When Ruby's name was called, she walked to the podium without looking at the crowd. She didn't bring a printed speech. She brought a worn paperback, the same one she had carried into the Harrow's penthouse, the book her grandfather gave her, the one Mr. Ishikawa had returned. She opened it to the front cover and placed it on the podium. Then she looked up, and she began. My name is Ruby Grayson. I am 12 years old, almost 13. My story isn't about power, it's about silence, and how dangerous it can be. She paused, letting her voice settle. Last fall, I spoke out in a room where I wasn't supposed to speak. I read something I wasn't supposed to read, and I changed the direction of something much bigger than me. She glanced down at the book. My grandfather said language was a door, that you could either use it to escape or to walk through something hard. She looked at the audience. I chose to walk through. The room was still. Every sound was swallowed by her voice. I've learned that doing the right thing doesn't make you a hero. It doesn't get you a medal. It just lets you sleep at night. She smiled gently. And sometimes, that's enough. When she stepped down, there was no applause at first, just a hush. Then the clapping came. Not loud, but steady, earned. That night, back at home, Rosa watched her daughter write in the same notebook she had carried for months. The window was open. A breeze moved the curtains. Somewhere down the street, someone played a saxophone, its notes curling into the night like smoke. Rosa sat beside her. Are you writing about today? No, Ruby said. Not yet. What then? Ruby tapped the pencil to her page. About what comes next. Rosa smiled. And what is that? Ruby looked up, her eyes steady, her voice soft. Everything.